Not already. Thank you very much. Jack, are you ready to start?
I am indeed ready to go now. I just need to do a wee tweak to my screen.
Yes, do that, please. We've just got a plain green screen at the moment.
Yes, you have. So
Is that what it's meant?
I'm starting to speak now. The green screen's there for a reason.
Well,
folks, it's very nice to be here tonight, and I've been really looking forward to doing this paper. William Butler Yeats, for reasons which will become apparent, is a great favorite of mine. And really, this is the work that we've been doing in this tour up to now. So you've had that one. You've had that one. I hope you enjoyed it. You've had that one, and that one. And this is the finale, the denouement, as they say in theatrical circles. William Butler Yeats, the mystic and the influence of Freemasonry. William Butler Yeats is very famous in Ireland and in Britain. He's probably less well known here, but I would imagine some of you will be aware of him, maybe many of you for all I know, but I don't think everybody will be as aware of him as we would be back in the UK and Ireland. He's actually, and I know you've heard this phrase before, and I've been using it ad nauseum, he's Anglo-Irish. I'm not going to go into a great deliberation about Anglo-Irish. You've had it before, but he was a descendant of Jervis Yeats, who came to Ireland in 1690 with King William, Prince of Orange. He was the driving force behind what was called the Irish literary revival at the end of the 19th century, or sometimes called the Irish literary renaissance. Ireland in those days, although it had many good writers, it really was, as far as theatre was concerned, it was dependent on English touring companies, and Yeats and a few others decided they were going to do something to fix that. In order to trace his role in Ireland and in Freemasonry, I need to go through a few topics before we get to the hub of the matter. But if you really want to read something in detail about Yeats and the Masonic connections, there's a very good paper by Professor Martha Suchard. I actually contacted Professor Suchard and had some discussion with her in preparing this paper. She's a professor in America, and she wrote a paper called Swedenborg, Yeats and the Jacobite Freemasonry, and it's really worth reading. Yeats had many interests. Obviously, Freemasonry was one of them, and we'll come to that. He was also very interested in Druidism and Irish folklore, and he was interested in the occult. And although some of his more far out interests were part of his earlier days, and he kind of set them to the side a little bit, he remained interested in the occult and in Freemasonry for the remainder of his life. He was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and I'll come to that later. He was a member of the precursor of what is now the IRA. He was a member, and he was Protestant Anglo-Irish, remember. He was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the precursor to the IRA. And he was also elected, is a rather inappropriate term for the Irish Senate, but he was appointed to the Irish Senate as a senator twice, and he served very well there. As an aside, his son Michael also served as a senator, and he was also a member of the European Parliament representing Ireland back in the 1980s. W.B. Yeats, William Butler Yeats, won the Nobel Prize for Literature back in, I think, about 1923. And that was a big achievement. And it was well deserved, in my opinion, but not just my opinion. Obviously, if he got it, other people were of that opinion. And he used his speech at the prize giving ceremony. He used his speech to put on the international table the fact that Ireland at that point was now a free state, and he gave quite an interesting speech, and I'll come to something about that also a little bit later. One of his most famous lines, and those of us who have lived in Ireland will be very cognizant of this particular line. He wrote a poem after the 1916 Rising, and the poem was called Easter 1916, and he had a wonderful line. It was "A terrible beauty is born." And I'll mention something about that a little later. So when we started these lectures, we started with an Irish rebellion in 1798, and we're doing the last lecture, and here we are. They're a very fractious lot. We're now at the 1916 Rising, so rebellion was the order of the day. When he made his speech in the Senate when he was elected, he was referring to the Anglo-Irish, because the Anglo-Irish were very much threatened by the creation of the Irish Free State. And in fact, if you were a landed person, one of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, a landed person, you would have actually suffered with property taxes, inheritance taxes, and you would have also possibly not been able to keep your grand house, etc. So there was a reason for them to be a little bit edgy. But don't forget, I said that Yeats was a big supporter of the Irish independence movement. But this is what he said, and I think it's a wonderful thing. He said, speaking of the Anglo-Irish, "We are no petty people. We are one of the great stocks of Europe. We are the people of Burke," that's Edmund Burke. "We are the people of Swift, the people of Emmet, the people of Parnell. We have created most of the modern literature of this country, and we have created the best of its political intelligence." And I'll tell you a little humorous thing about that. I have played around the place in Irish bands, and I'm very knowledgeable about traditional Irish music. And I was playing in an Irish band back in the early 2000s. And one of the guys was from Limerick, and he decided to open a pub in the adjacent town here, Fielding. And I said to him, so Dachi was his name, that's Davy in English. I said, "So Dachi, what are you going to call your pub?" And he said, "The Sean O'Casey." I said to him, "That's a grand name." I said, "Let me tell you two things about Sean O'Casey. It wasn't his name, and he was a Protestant." So I enlightened them to the history of Sean O'Casey. And when I went to the opening of the bar, it said above the door, "Murray's Bar." So I said to him, "So Dachi, what happened to Shawnee?" And he says, "Oh, my grandmother was called Murray. I thought it did that." I said, "So my story had no influence." So it's just a little illustration of some of the still tensions and sensitivities about the thing. So what I've shown you there on the screen is obviously an image of him as a senator, and down below is Synod Éireann, which is the Irish Senate. So yeah, that's something where they made this. It's a two-house system. Yeats's influences were many, starting mostly with his family at the beginning. I like this little saying. He was speaking of another Irish individual, and he said, "Being Irish, he had an abiding sense of tragedy, which sustained him through temporary periods of joy." And there's many people, and I think it's not unique to the Irish, but I think that's a lovely thing. And for those of you who might be educationalists, and I class myself as one of those, and I'm married to one, I think the next little saying is really poignant. Education isn't the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. I think that's really good. So he was interested in Freemasonry at an early age, and he couldn't be anything else because particularly his uncle George. Now I'm going to say, as it's written, George's family name, and I'll tell you why it's not correct. His uncle was called George Pollexfen, Pollexfen. That's actually pronounced in the unusual English way as Poulsen. So George Poulsen was his uncle, and the family actually went to live with the uncle. I just explained quickly why. W.B. Yeats's father had started studying to be a lawyer, and he quickly gave that away when he was quite a young man and went to art school. And when he went to art school in Dublin, he then decided he was going to go to England. And he had a family at the time, and he dragged them all off to England to support him when he was doing his art. And the family were very much artists, as you'll probably be aware. Some of you will be that his brother Jack was an excellent and quite famous artist. The whole family were steeped in it. But the thing is that he came back from England, and they didn't have a lot of money, and they had to live with his mother's family, the Paul Fixons or the Poulsens. So his uncle was a very enthusiastic member of Freemasonry, and he was also a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He was in the second order of the Golden Dawn, if you know what that's about. And he practiced what was called magic. In the second order, of the Golden Dawn, they practice a form of white magic. And he also read horoscopes and he read the tarot. And in fact, when they were allowing members into the Golden Dawn, they would get him to cast a horoscope to make sure that the stars were in alignment or whatever, and before people got admitted. And he did exactly that when William Butler Yeats was admitted into the order. So William Butler Yeats studied the occult in his formative years with his uncle. And the question then arises, and it's a question which has been much debated in the academic press, as to whether he was a Freemason or not. There's actually no firm, tangible evidence that he was indeed a Freemason, but there's lots of circumstantial evidence which leads us to believe he was a member of some form of Freemasonry, and possibly regular Freemasonry. He used many Masonic images in his writings, his poetry, and his plays, mostly in his poetry though. And you have to remember, I'm going to quote something that Napoleon said. We dealt with Napoleon a while back. Napoleon said, if you want to know what way a man thinks, try and think about what life was like for him when he was 20. And that applies very well to William Butler Yeats, because he lived in a time of political turmoil and social turmoil. The Balkans were in conflict. The First World War was going. England's oldest colony, Ireland, as I mentioned before, was in rebellion. The Russian Revolution was ticking along, and things were pretty bad. And of course, the European royalty and the European establishment were very worried about things developing in a way which wouldn't have been beneficial to them. And Yeats had to live through that, and it influenced to some degree his writing. His references to Freemasonry come by way of mentioning symbols that we have in Freemasonry. The winding stairs, for example, is a big image that he uses. And also, you'll see what I've got on the screen, of course, is not his writings. You'll see one's by Albert Mackey, and one's just an image of the winding stair, a Freemasonry image. The winding stairs at the bottom is actually a very good podcast if you want to listen to it. And the image in the middle, of course, is a sprig of acacia. So he referred to that as well in his writings, and we'll come to that in a little while. So he had the title of one of his poetry books, and he wrote many, was The Winding Stairs, The Winding Stair and Other Poems. He wrote that in 1933. And for an excellent, I've already mentioned, there's an excellent description of Freemasonry and him in the Suchard book, or Suchard paper, to be more precise. Now, Yeats was a man, although originally he didn't have much money until he got the Nobel Prize, but he always liked to live rather well. And he was very friendly with Lady Gregory. Now, I won't go into a whole big description about Lady Gregory, but she was formative. Oh, damn it, excuse me, my wife will get that. She was formative to his development, and she lived on a big estate. She was also Anglo-Irish, and she lived on a big estate in Galway called Cool Park. And that you're looking at is a tower from an old Norman tower that was built on her estate. And Yeats bought it in the early 1900s. He bought it for the princely sum of 35 quid. That wasn't the going price, of course, for a tower in those days, but Lady Gregory was rather sympathetic to him, and she had plenty of money anyway, and she let him have it. He bought it around about 1915, 1916. And I have to make a little joke here. I used to be the chief executive of a local government body. And one of the things I learned at an early stage, it might sound nice if somebody comes and offers you a piece of land or a nice building and say, here you are, there's a building I'd like to give you to let's say, to a council. Never accept it. It's a liability coming your way. And I'm afraid that proved to be something true for dear old William as well. So he lived there from 1921 to 1929. And that's where he wrote his poem about the winding stair, and of course other poetry. He abandoned it in 1929, and I'm afraid that it kind of fell into disrepute. And you can see why. Look where the foot of the tower is. It's in the bloody river, pardon my French. And that proved to be a big problem. The Irish government, actually, because it's the national monument, tried to rescue it a few years ago. And I believe that flooding has been an ongoing problem. The poem that he wrote about the tower was to do with him. This was a dream that he had. and he was going up the winding stairs in the tower up to the top. And he did it. Another of his poems was called Dialogue Between Self and Soul. This idea of you talking to your soul, or in his case, him talking to his soul, wasn't a new one. Andrew Marvell did it also back in the 17th century. So Yeats used that idea, and he was going up this winding stair, deliberating about himself with his soul, wondering what was going to be happening to him. And he thought he was going off into a spiritual experience. As he climbed the tower, he decided to resist and work his way back down. So the poet really is resisting the drag that the soul was making on him to ascend the winding stair and to return to the physical world. But of course, what it is, it's a rehash of the old story. It's a rehash of Isis and Osiris. It's the birth and death cycle thing. And we as Freemasons, and he, of course, also would have been very aware of the Hiramic ritual in the third degree. And it's the same, so that it's associated with that. So that's one of the clues that Yeats was actually involved in Freemasonry in some form or another. That's an actual image of the winding stair. You wouldn't want to be ascending that, or even worse, descending it after you've had a few jars. It's a pretty rough looking ascent. And the other one, of course, is just the Masonic image. So I'll refer some more to his poem in a writing that he called The Tower, and that's where he had the poem about the winding stair. He also wrote another poem within the tower. There's a number of sub-poems in the tower, and it's got 7 stanzas in it, seven sections to it. And one of them, believe it or not, is quite concerned about the execution of Jacques de Molay. Now, those of you who are members of the KTs or who know something about the KTs, the Knights Templar, will realize that Jacques de Molay was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. It's quite interesting, the poem, and don't worry, if you're really not a fan of poetry, I'm not going to read it to you, except for a very short bit. It's really, he uses it quite interestingly. He uses it, the Jacques de Molay thing, he uses it as a metaphor for the French Revolution, because you will be aware that the French Revolution, apparently we were to blame for it, the Masons were in some way involved in it, if you can believe the conspiracy theorists. And he uses it also as a double metaphor, because he uses it as a metaphor for the Irish Civil War. That's not the Rising in 1916, it's the Civil War, which broke out in 1922. I'll not bore you with the details of it, but it was a very tortuous period in Ireland, and it ripped the country apart, as civil wars tend to do. So the execution of Jacques de Molay took place in Paris on the 18th of March, 1314. And he'd been arrested 7 years before. I'll just say something, because I read something when I was researching this, that was Black Friday, but of course it wasn't. People get this wrong. Black Friday, Friday the 13th, was when the Templars, including Molay, were arrested. And it was 7 years before that. It was, I think, about the Friday the 13th of October, if my memory serves me right. And it's quite interesting, because Jacques de Molay had gone up to Paris to attend, well, among other things, he was discussing the possibility of another crusade. And he was also one of the main mourners at the funeral of the King of France's sister, Catherine de Courtenay. So he was, one day he was the main mourner. The very next day was the 13th, and that was the day he was arrested and taken into custody. I won't bore you with all the details of Jacques de Molay, but you really need to look it up. It's quite an interesting tale. And the fact of the matter is that he eventually was sentenced, along with others, to life imprisonment, as they say nowadays, without the possibility of parole. And he actually spoke, others didn't, but he and another knight spoke at the time they were sentenced, to point out how unjust this was and iniquitous. And that infuriated the king, who had them taken away the very same day and burnt in Paris, just outside. If you've been to Paris, it's right where Notre Dame Cathedral is, and that's a little plaque which is obviously on the wall or on the pavement in Paris. It's on the Ile de Cité, I think is how you pronounce it, and you can see one of the famous bridges of the Seine in the background of the picture there. So on Thursday, the 12th of October, he was the main mourner, and the next day he was a bunch of ashes, I suppose you'd say. Just bear with while I flick my notes over. So how did it all happen? I mean, I'm not going into too much detail. I've already given you a little bit of an idea, but the main thing to take away from this is if you ever lend money, don't lend it to royalty and don't lend it to the papacy, because you'll fall foul when the time comes for them to have to pay back. And the fact of the matter is that King Philip the Bell, as he was called, the Bell meaning that he was a really handsome chap. Apparently he was a tall fellow, blonde hair, etc. Handsome chap. And he wanted not to have to pay his debts, and he also wanted to discuss with the Pope with the possibility of another crusade, which the Pope was pressurizing him for. The king actually trumped up some charges. The charges were of heresy and sodomy, and that's why I've put the middle little image up, because one of the things that they used in the sodomy accusation was the Knights Templar symbol, where you've got two knights on a horse, sharing the horse. That was seen to be rather too pally for the papacy and for the king, and that was one of the charges, amongst others, some quite ridiculous charges, and that's really what they were charged with. They were really the victims of corruption, and the consequences of this reverberated down through the centuries. So where are we then with old William B. Butler Yeats? Well, the poem that I mentioned to you in a bigger poem called The Tower, it has this particular section in it, and it's got to do with the fact this isn't actually to do with Jacques de Molay himself. It's got to do with the execution of Louis XVI during the French Revolution. And the poem says, this is when the king's head was taken off. Vengeance upon the murderers, the cry goes up. Vengeance for Jacques Molay. In cloud pale rags or in lace, the rage-driven, rage-tormented, and rage-hungry trooper belaboring trooper, biting at arm and face, plunges towards nothing. Arms and fingers spreading wide for the embrace of nothing, and I, at my wits astray, because of all that senseless tumult, all but cried for vengeance on the murderers of Jacques Molay. And you will be aware, or most of you will, of the story that when the king's head was struck off, there was a cry from the crowd, Jacques de Molay is revenged. And that's what he's referring to there. But when you get to know this verse and a little bit more of the poem, which I won't bother you with, what you can actually see, if you look at the bit where it says in cloud pale rags, that's a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the poor people of Paris, in this case. And the lace represents the aristocrats. And of course, at the beginning, apart from the ones who were getting their heads lobbed off, there was a reasonable amount of peace amongst them, except for the revolution itself. But they weren't fighting with each other. And the fact of the matter is that eventually that they started fighting among themselves. That's why, for example, Robespierre, who was part of the original setup for the French Revolution, Robespierre himself had his head chopped off. So the image that he's creating here is that these things start off on a good cause, and they become tumultuous, and they become corrupted. And that's what happens in all of these situations. And he uses that metaphor for the Irish Civil War, because what happened in the Irish Civil War was that there was a treaty which was signed by the likes of Michael Collins, and it was signed with the British, of course, and there was disagreement within the Irish Republicans Some did not want to accept the treaty because it partitioned the north of Ireland, the 6 counties in the north. And when Michael Collins was signing that treaty, he made the comment that he was signing his death warrant, which turned out to be true because he was assassinated not too long after that. But that's again what Yeats was saying is, so something starts off for a good cause. I don't mean to be offensive, but to English people, but getting the English out of Ireland. And the cause, from an Irish perspective, was a good cause, but eventually they start fighting among themselves. Look at the American Civil War. That's what happens. Things start off as good causes and things start to fall apart. And that's what Yeats is saying in this piece of poetry. And it also applies, he was referring to 1922. He died in 1939. He's referring to 1922, but of course it applies also to what's commonly called the Troubles, which I lived through, which started, depending what perspective you want to take, 1969, and can be argued to be still ongoing. So it was, Yeats was referring to the execution of Louis XVI. And one of the things that happened with that was that the Catholic Church was removed from power in France, and there was an expropriation of some of their wealth as well. And it's been argued that in some circles, that what you might call the architects of the medieval cathedrals, in other words, the Masons, in this case, operative Masons, were also the architects of the French Revolution. Not literally, but the same group of people, except moving from the operative to the speculative Masonry. And Yeats explains it by saying that the cry for vengeance for the murderer of Jacques de Molay is said to have been incorporated into the ritual of certain Masonic societies in the 18th century and to have fed class hatred. So the cry went up, Jacques de Molay is revenged, and the 18th century French Freemasons were known to want to claim an association with the Knights Templar organization. Just as, I mean, I'm a Knights Templar. I like to think we've got some connection to them, albeit spiritual rather than historically correct. They also symbolically identify Hiram Abiff with Jacques de Molay. Why? Because Abiff refused to reveal the secret password, and de Molay refused to reveal the Templar secrets. I've put up on the screen there just a little map. The reason that France was so involved with the Knights Templars and suffered so much in the demise is shown on the screen there, because the vast majority of commanderies, let's call them forts, during the time of Black Friday in the 13th century, the majority of them, as you can see from the screen, were located in France. And I'm quite interested when you look at the other little sort of simplified map on the left, at the distribution of them, including Clontarf in Ireland, which we spoke about a little while ago in another paper. So where else did William Butler Yeats refer to Freemasonry in his writings? He wrote a poem, and that's the title of it there, in memory of Alfred Coulson, you remember? And it's not a partial memory. What's partial is the bit of the poem. And the poem says, Masons drove from miles away to scatter the acacia spray upon a melancholy man who had ended where his life began. Now, to understand the significance of the acacia spray and what happens at a Masonic funeral, you'd have to know something about Freemasonry, and you really would have to have some understanding of the third degree. So we have to ask ourselves, was in fact William Butler Yeats initiated as a Freemason in a regular lodge, or even indeed in a not regular lodge? Another area where he made cryptic reference to Freemasonry was in the poem. It's the same poem that I took the bit about the cry for Jacques de Molay. That was what you call the 7th stanza, the 7th section of the poem. This is the 3rd stanza or section. And the poem was actually called Meditations in Time of Civil War. He wrote this during the Civil War. Yeats was actually trapped in his house by the Irish rebels, and the family were scared for their safety. And this is a poem that he wrote the whole thing round about the same time that was happening. And he says in it, he's describing, he's sitting in his study, he's been doing some writing, and he's sitting in his study and he says, 2 heavy trestles and a board, where Sato's gift, a changeless sword, by pen and paper lies, that it may moralize my days out of their aimlessness. Now, the sword that he's referring to is the sword shown in the right-hand image, and the person holding the sword is Junzo Sato, as an old man. He was a young man when he had the early connection with Yeats. And he was so impressed with Yeats's poetry and with a speech that Yeats gave in Seattle way back in the 1920s, I think, that he gave a present, a wonderful present to Yeats of a 500-year-old samurai sword, which had been in his family. You can imagine the emotional attachment he must have had to that sword. And that sword features in Yeats's poetry time and time again, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly. But he talks about 2 heavy trestles and a board. Now, of course, what he's talking about, we're looking for cryptic references here, and what he's talking about is the tracing board, because you can call the tracing board, you can call it a tracing board, or you can call it a trestle. I believe some American law just call it a trestle. And he's referring there to a Masonic image when he's talking about the pen and paper and the sword lying on the table. He also, it's quite interesting, in another poem quite close to this one, he talks about something called the Stairs Nest, S-T-A-R-E-S, Stairs Nest. In Ireland, parts of Ireland, we call the Starling Stair. So there's a stairs nest just outside his house, and he's sitting probably at the 2 heavy trestles and a board. He's sitting looking out the window, and he sees a stairs nest. And at the stairs nest are some bees. Now, I told you at a previous lecture that bees are a symbol of Freemasonry, and I freely admit I'm stretching the point a little bit here, but Yeats refers to the fact that the bees are in the stairs nest. And this is when he's looking at this table, which I think he's being referred to as a tracing board. And he's looking at the bees and describing how busy they are. And in my previous lecture, I said that the busyness of the bee and the working together of the bees was something which was important in Masonry, still is in France, and was for us up until the early parts of the 1900s, when we stopped using the symbol. But old images in lodge rooms will sometimes have a beehive as part of the symbolism. The thing about the Irish Civil War, as far as Yeats was concerned, it kind of changed his mind about the politics of Ireland. Because the thing is, of course, it's all very nice and well to want to bring about change until there's blood on the ground. And Yeats did not particularly like what was happening. And he certainly didn't like the fact that the Republican parties, of which he was initially a member, with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that they started fighting amongst themselves. And in fact, there was a wonderful saying by another Irish writer, Sean O'Casey, who I referred to earlier with the pub name. Sean O'Casey was a superb playwright in the early 1900s, right up until probably the 1950s. And he wrote Juno and the Paycock and The Shadow of a Gunman, if you're familiar with some of those things. And he said, in relation to Yeats becoming somewhat disillusioned, and I told you about the terrible beauty, he said, the sheen had come, oh yes, the terrible beauty appeared to be losing her good looks. So I thought that was a rather nice way of expressing it. So the use of metaphor in his poetry was informed by his exposure to these things, and by his exposure and his knowledge of Freemasonry. And also he must have had, of course, some familiarity. I'm not suggesting he was a Knights Templar, but he would have had some familiarity with the Knights Templar. He lived such an interesting life. When you learn about William Butler Yeats, the life he led was absolutely unbelievable at times. This bit is called The Poet, His Wife, and the Craft. Now, William Butler Yeats had a passion in his life for a female, which I will come to later, but it wasn't his wife. And that his wife, he married that girl. That was her name was Georgie, known as George, Georgie Hyde Lees. And she was 25 when he was 51, and he married her purely because He wanted to have a son and heir. The marriage actually worked out very well if she could keep her sort of attention away from the fact that he was a bit of a philanderer. But the marriage did work out quite well. And after they were married, they went off to Oxford for a period. Yeats did tend to move about, although he lived in Ireland. He went lived in England for a while. He also went to Mallorca for holidays and to France for holidays, moved about, but he went to Oxford for a period of time. And this is where there's more evidence for the fact that he might have had some activity with Masonic lodges. When I contacted Professor Suchard, I was asking permission to quote some of her work actually in my paper, and she was very gracious about it. And she told me that one of her lecturers, I suppose, when she was at university, with whom she became professionally friendly, was Professor Richard Ellman. Professor Ellman was an authority on William Butler Yeats, and he made his career out of it. And Suchard had also gone to England after Yeats was dead to meet with Professor Ellman, who was on sabbatical there. And he said to her, he was very ill at the time. He eventually died, of course. He was very ill at the time. And he said to her, look, I have somewhere in my papers documentary evidence that Yeats went and visited a co-Masonic lodge when he was living in Oxford, and his wife also went along. It was probably an Écossaise, a Scottish lodge, or possibly a Rose Croix lodge. But the thing is that Professor Ellman, who was a very reliable source, said that he had documentary evidence. Professor Suchard asked him if she could see it, and unfortunately, he couldn't find it in his papers. He had a mass of papers, as you might imagine, and he couldn't find it. And they're still there. It's still there somewhere in his papers, and I believe that it actually existed. So the circumstantial evidence is what I might describe as tantalizing when you take it in conjunction with some of the other stuff that I have referred to. Now we get to an even more interesting bit. The lady that you're looking at, she looks like something out of Wagner, the Furies or something. That's Maud Gonne. Now Maud Gonne, if you're Irish, you've got to have heard of Maud Gonne. Somebody tried to tell me it was pronounced, I gave an early version of this paper somewhere, and somebody tried to tell me he was absolutely convinced it was pronounced Gunny, but it's not. It's Maud Gonne. And it's Maud Gonne was the passion that I referred to earlier. He absolutely, one could say he loved her, or one could say he lusted after her. Either way, he certainly wanted to get to grips with her. And Maud Gonne was an heiress, and she was 23, an English heiress, and she was 23 when she met Yeats. She said that when she met him, he was a paint-stained art student, and that's probably true. She was very, very strange, and you'll hear something very strange as I plow my way through this. Please excuse me while I have a drink. Very thirsty. She was intensely interested in the occult, and she also was a member of the Golden Dawn. She was 18 months younger than William Butler Yeats, and he proposed to her in 1891, 1899, 1900, and 1901. And every time he got the bum's rush. During all of that time, he only had one other love affair, and that was with a woman called Olivia Shakespeare, and that ran from 1894 to 1897. Now, we're going to come across the conception of Maud Gonne's daughter at some point in this story, but before we get to that, we have to move forward a little bit in her life. And she did have a daughter, and Yeats actually proposed to her as well when she was 23 years old. Now, it's not as strange as you might think, because when she was 15, she herself said to Yeats that he should marry her. She may have been joking as a teenager, but one doesn't know. But he did ask her at 23, and by that stage, she changed her mind. In fact, one of her friends said to her, well, no, this is Maud Gonne, in fact, but she was young as well. When Maud Gonne said she was interested in him, people tried to talk her away. And that's one of the reasons why I think she decided that she wouldn't marry him. But she married other people as well. And we'll have a little look at that. Now, Maud Gonne, after she had turned down Yeats a few times, she had gone to France for a period of time. And when she was a young woman at the time, and she met a fellow called Lucien Millevoye. And Lucien Millevoye was French. And in fact, he was sort of tipped as a potential French prime minister. So he was a pretty well-positioned fellow. And I don't think they married, but they got together and they had a son. And they called the son George. Unfortunately, George died at the age of 2. And they separated. That's basically it. They couldn't get a divorce because they weren't married, but they separated and they went their own way. But something very strange happened. As I said, Maud was very peculiar, and she had the idea in her head that if she could go to the cemetery, and it was a tomb rather than an underground grave, if she could go to the cemetery with the father of her baby and have sexual intercourse in the tomb, at the tomb, that by some form of transmigration of souls, the new baby would have the soul of the deceased baby George. And indeed they did that. And there's evidence that they did that because Yeats mentions it in his posthumous biography, which was published about 1972. And he mentioned that this was something that she told him. And he firmly believed it, that she'd done that. Well, there was another baby to Millevoye, so there's even more evidence that it happened. And the baby was the girl Iseult. And she's the one that Yeats offered to marry as well. So then Maud Gonne, she's free because she's left Millevoye. And she marries another strange person. Well, she didn't marry the first one, but she gets together with and marries another strange person called Major John McBride. Now, he was one out of the book, Major McBride. He must be the most unfortunate man who ever drew breath, because he got executed during the 1916 rebellion, and he only went for a walk. I'll tell you why in a minute. The fact of the matter is that he had gone, when the Boer War was on, he was very anti-British, and when the Boer War was on, he decided to go over and see if he could lend a hand. He had no military experience at all. He wasn't a proper major. He was a sort of pretend major. The Boers told him he was a major and gave him a regiment to look after, and he called it the Irish Brigade. They even fought their own countrymen. They fought the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers. Didn't go too well, but he didn't get killed, and he managed to slope back home. And so the rebellion breaks out at the GPO, and he's out for a bit of a walk, taking the air, one would say. And he sees a load of guys walking down the road, led by a man who has a sort of military sort of posture, asks him what's going on. And the guy says, oh, we're going to throw the British out and we're going to the GPO. He said, can I come? And he did. And that's what happened to him. He ended up getting captured. To be honest, I'm making a bit light of it, but to be honest, he was given a detachment to manage, and they were all caught, and he was shot. And thereby, Maud Gonne was free. She left him anyway. She was only married to him for a short time. He sounds as if he was a pretty violent man with her. And Yeats was absolutely furious when she married him, because he could see that his opportunity was becoming even less than it had previously been. So that's Maud Gonne. She was a very interesting person. What I'm telling you, let's go back. What I'm telling you about Maud Gonne is fact, and it was covered by the BBC in a report in 2015. So if you want to go onto the internet and find out more about Maud Gonne and her goings on in her son's tomb, the BBC have a program about it. So Yeats was also involved, of course, in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And this is, again, more circumstantial evidence for his involvement with Freemasonry, because the people that you're looking at on the screen, William Robert Woodman, Dr. Robert Filkin, Wynne Westcott, and MacGregor Mathers, were all Freemasons. And Yeats, of course, was very much involved with them. And they set up the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Filkin is an interesting fellow from our point of view here in New Zealand. He was initiated into Freemasonry in Edinburgh in 1907, and he went through the 3 degrees very quickly. January for his initiation, 12th of February for being passed, and the 26th of February for being raised. So it was pretty rapid promotion, so to speak. He then moved to Havelock North in New Zealand, and he founded in the UK before he came out. He founded Stella Matutina, which means the morning star. And when he came out to New Zealand, he brought that with him. Yeats was a very long time member of that organization. When Philcom came out, he set up another organization. I struggle to pronounce it. Smara Gagdum Thalassi's Temple of Stella Matutina. And he set that up a museum, and it took a Maori name, Whare Ra. And Philcom was also a member of the Rosicrucian Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, SRIA, and was an inspector for Australasia. And in fact, the college, I'm also a member, as you're probably aware if you've listened to me before. There were 4 colleges in New Zealand, and the college in Havelock North is named after Philcom, named in his honor. So the association that these guys had with Freemasonry inevitably would have been of influence and rubbed off on Yeats. So what we've got there, of course, is the image of Yeats and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the symbol for Freemasonry. Many people from his childhood surrounding him were Freemasons. Membership of the Golden Dawn, his interest in the occult and mysticism, his Masonic references in his writings, they all provide circumstantial evidence that he may have been a member. In the long run, it's impossible to believe that foolishness is greatness, one commentator on Yeats said, because he believed in all these very strange things. Perhaps Freemasonry wasn't so very strange, but his interest in the occult, and also something which I didn't mention, automatic writing. His wife, Georgie, apparently had the skill for receiving messages from people on the other side of the veil and being able to transfer that through something called automatic writing. Some people think it may have been a means of entertaining him so that he would keep his hands off her for a while, because you might be interested to know that he had an operation when he was in his late 60s. It was something, I've forgotten the name, but something like the Steinbach procedure. And the Steinbach procedure was for the surgeon to do something dramatic and I can imagine incredibly painful to the vast difference, and to cause some physiological changes in the body. It also involved, in some cases, the experimentation went on with the testicles of guinea pigs, and this is all genuine stuff. And they extracted things and injected it in. That's where the idea of monkey gland injections comes from. But Yeats had this procedure, and he was very enthusiastic, being an older fellow, to have this when he was married to a younger woman. So yeah, I think that's actually an interesting insight into his mind. Although somebody said that it's impossible to forgive foolishness, someone else said, but everyone who loves poetry can forgive him. And I think that that's probably true. So we'll move on now. So I think I provided circumstantial evidence of his membership. So his death, this was also interesting. He wasn't feeling too chipper, and he decided to go off to France, which he did from time to time, and off he went. But unfortunately, he became much more unwell down around the south of France, and he died in 1939 at a hotel called the Hotel Ideal Séjour in Menton in France, and he was 73 years old. He was buried privately in France, and he told his wife, he knew he was dying by this stage, and he told his wife, Georgie, to bury him first of all in France and leave him for a year, and when the newspapers had forgotten him, to dig him up, and I quote him, and plant me in Sligo. And that's where he is planted, because I've been and seen his grave. My friend, her father is planted just not too far away, so I visited the cemetery a few times. So he wanted to be brought back, but unfortunately Hitler had other ideas, and World War II got in the way, and he was later, the Irish then sent later on in about, I think, 1948, the Irish sent one of their Navy ships, the Maca, to bring the body home to Ireland. Now, there's a little joke about the Irish Navy and the Maca, which I'm going to share with you, because somebody said it was the only Navy you could join where you actually go home for lunch. And the Dubliners did a little song about it, which I'm not going to sing you. But one of the verses, there were 3 ships. You know, you don't want a big Navy when you're a wee country. So there were 3 ships. And the chorus in the song went, the Clona, the Maeve, and the Maca. The pride of the Irish Navy, when the captain, he blows on his whistle, all the sailors go home for their tea. So quite interesting. So what's my conclusion then in this paper? Well, was he a regular Freemason? You can see from my little friend on the right of your screen, I'm holding my arms and going, I don't know. Did Freemasonry have a significant role on his work? Undoubtedly it had. Did he have an understanding of Freemasonry? Yes, he did, to some degree, and probably quite a large degree. His writings provide us with tantalizing insight into his Masonic interests. It seems to me that he did join, he did attend a non-regular lodge, and I think he may have been a Mason, but I don't know. And in the end, the student of Yeats and the student of Freemasonry must weigh up the evidence and decide for themselves. And that, gentlemen, concludes my paper.
Thank you, Jack. You were on a roll tonight. Now we'll just let you disconnect your screen. What's the word? I forgot what it means. Unshare your screen. Can you do that?
Share.
Stop share. I couldn't think of the word.
You have to get the terminology right, Mike.
Stop it right. Yeah. So can you stop sharing your screen?
There we go.
You should be able. Yes, there we are. We can see everybody now. I'll just give you a few minutes, Jack, just to recover yourself and have a drink and just clear your thoughts. We have a few announcements. Is there anybody here from the Masters and Past Masters Lodge or from the top of the South Lodge who wants to express their thanks to Jack? Now is your chance. You need to say something and then it lights up on my screen. Otherwise, I've got several pages.
Yeah.
Here we go.
My name's Peter Robertson. I come up as just Peter and I can't do anything about that. Jack, tomorrow night you would have been in Waitoa Lodge in Picton and you would have had more of our members there than what you've got tonight. But the interesting thing that I find about you is that this afternoon I was painting a trellis for my daughter and I was watching the paint dry and I thought Jack would have known how to make a Masonic link with that and give us an interesting talk, because if you could talk on paint drying, you can talk on anything, and you actually can. It's quite outstanding. If I could add a bit about William Butler Yeats, yeah, he's well known in this country, but mostly for one poem. It's not his most famous apparently, but is in New Zealand. And when I was a 14-year-old schoolboy, I was being lectured on the poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. And the teacher said, why did he have 9 bean rows? It says 9 bean rows will I plant there and a hive for the honeybee. And the story was that no one knew why he said 9, why would he want to plant 9 bean rows? So he went round the class and I was half asleep and he said, what do you think, Robertson? And I said, oh, sounds better than 6, sir. And he said, you're most probably exactly right, because no one knows, but it sounds good in the context, 9 bean rows, it goes together. And when I was in Ireland, I was traveling from Derry down to Galway, and what happens, there's a lake there, Loch Gill. And I said, hey, that's where Innisfree is. So we did our best to find it, went round the back, got lost, spent the night, and still couldn't find it. And I missed it by about 100 yards. But never mind, we know about it. But anyway, Jack, thanks immensely. It's been a great lecture series, and I hope you can come to Top of the South sometime. We'll give you a great well, especially in my home area, which is Greymouth. Advanced Mara Lodge meets at Shantytown, which is 7k south of Grey, and you'll be able to see a wee bit of history there too. So thanks a lot. We really appreciate your efforts.
Thank you very much. I'll just say that your teacher was, of course, correct about the 9 rows of vis-a-vis the 6 rows, because Yeats himself said that anybody who tries to explain poetry only destroys it. I'm paraphrasing there. It's not always possible, but sometimes you just have to feel it.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Anybody here from Masters and Past Masters? Is Di Everly here or anybody? No? Okay, well, that's fine. Well, we did have a question about recordings. As you know, we have 6 recordings, and with the help of David Chichinadze, I can see him on my screen. I don't know if you can there, he's waving now, who is the driving force in an organization called Saperi Audi. It's from Georgia, that's the European Georgia, not the American Georgia. They have recorded and stored well over 200 videos, and you can access those through YouTube. And so David is helping us to do that with our recordings. All you have to do, it might not be immediately, but all you have to do is to go to YouTube and key in ANZMRC, and you will have access to these recordings, and we hope many more in the future. Now, I said that Jack's tour didn't happen, but in fact, that's not quite correct, because 2 places, that's Palmerston North and New Plymouth, came in late. And as a result, they agreed to have their talk in October. So hoping that October is COVID-free, or at least COVID-kind to us, on the 4th of October, Jack will be presenting in Palmerston North live. And on the 27th of October, he will be presenting in New Plymouth live. And that will be literally the end of his tour. If you can make it, you can see him there. He's then coming in November up to the Waikato Lodge of Research, where he's going to present live, I hope, to us, and he will be presented with the Verrill lecturership for 2021. We also had a question about books. Where can I get a book? Quite right, here's the book, The Ramble Around the Pillars. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, this is one of 8 talks in Jack's book, 8 very good stories. The book itself is very well produced, nice large type, full color, and it's a very, very good read. We've organized that there would be 15 copies of this sent to every one of the centers that have been involved, the 12 centers involved. If you want a copy, the first thing to do is to contact your local research lodge, the hosts. If you can't get a copy that way, you can come through to us, through to Jack directly, or to me, or through ANZMRC, and we'll get a copy to you. It's $30, whichever you want. So that's fine. Now, Jack, how are you feeling? Are you ready to take a bit of a banter?
Of course, no problem whatsoever.
Jolly good. So the floor is open if anybody has any comments or questions. Silence.
I had my hand up there, Mike, but it may not have come up on the screen.
You have to say something, because if you're on a different page on my system, I can't see you. At the minute,
I was trying to be polite, but we'll put that aside.
Right, Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you very much, Jack, for another riveting presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I myself have been guilty of telling people that Yeats was a Mason, and I do find the circumstantial evidence to be very interesting and tantalizing, as you say. That said, I don't know if I'm 100% convinced either, if only because I've given a similar presentation on someone who's even less likely to be a Mason, and that was Mary Shelley. Maybe she would have attended a co-Mason's lodge at some point. There's no evidence that ever happened, but if you go through Frankenstein, there's a lot of Masonic language and Masonic concepts to unpack there. Granted, Yeats obviously would have had a lot of exposure to Masonic ideas. He knew Masons, and being a member of the Golden Dawn, I'm only really familiar with their first 2 degrees. But I have to say, there's a lot of familiar stuff in there. If you've been through craft masonry, I couldn't speak to chapter or mark or anything else, but there are a lot of familiar Masonic concepts there, and obviously a lot of avenues where he could have gotten that exposure to those ideas. And even the sprig of acacia, I imagine if he'd attended the Masonic funeral, he could have picked up something of that as well. So again, love the concept, and I really do hope that he was a Mason. I guess the jury's still out, as you say yourself, but yeah, very interesting to hear more about it, and I'm very glad to have attended. So thank you.
Michael, are you trying to say something there, or are you just shifting on your seat?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Jack, for that excellent and well-researched talk, which took you quite a lot of time to give, so it must have taken you a lot of time to research. As a member of another occult order, which is also operating here in New Zealand, I certainly heard some familiar names there, and I note with great interest that there's probably quite a bit of cross-pollination there between Freemasonry and Golden Dawn and other occult and esoteric orders.
Thank you. Yes,
Absolutely, I think so.
there's actually more cross-pollination, or whatever the word is. You know, several people here tonight are members of a research lodge called Quattro Coronati, the very first research lodge that was ever created, based in London, of course. And we argue that it was set up to be based purely on historical, factual evidence, and as a reaction against the more mystical, spiritual, and so on. But the interesting thing, and I'm sure Tony Baker will confirm this, is the number of people who were members of Quattro Coronati in its early days, who were also members of the Golden Dawn and many other organizations as well. Tony, can you support me on that?
Well, I'll support you in the statement that a lot of the early members were members of other organizations, as you described. But I would strongly disagree with you that the lodge was set up to be a purely authentic school historical society. In fact, my inaugural, they like to call it, but I think it's of it as a presidential address, was actually pointing out that Quattro Coronati actually was interested in the broad spectrum of Freemasonry when it was set up, but has gradually become a club for amateur historians. Yes.
Yeah, I actually said that some of its members today would argue that it was set up, whatever. But I'm in your court as well. Actually, if you go back, it was set up to have a very broad interest and not just a narrow historical focus. But over time, it seemed to be that one part was suppressed. The bit, in fact, that you like the most, isn't it, Tony? That would be the case.
Indeed, that's true.
What's
particularly
right,
so when you look at the index of the first few AQC volumes.
Absolutely.
Who's that? David? David Chichinazi, yeah.
Yep. Once again, good evening, brethren. Greetings from European Georgia, as Mike said. I have two questions, Brother Jack. First of all, Yeats and Crowley's have been quite close, I suppose. Well, at least that's what sources, public sources and some lecturers told me. And could you elaborate to what extent Yeats was interested in sex magic rituals? Because that could have been part of the ritual performed at the tomb of their son. So again, to what extent you have, during preparing your book, have met their interest in sex magic? And the second question is that in his late years, Crowley was living in a remote place and with a smaller crowd, I would say. And again, they were quite intensively engaged in sex magic rituals. So was Yeats anyhow involved living during those periods, or some part of it with him? In that
First of all,
remote community?
I just want to clarify something. I may have misunderstood something you said, but it wasn't Yeats who had the sex with Maud Gonne in the cemetery. It was her previous French partner. Lucien Millevoye. But yes, Yeats was interested. I don't know to what extent that he was interested in that, but he did have some association with Crawley at an early stage. He also he was a man known to mix with some very strange people. At one stage, he was also, and this is kind of off track a little, but I think it's important to understand it. He was once taken with fascism, and he got involved with something in Ireland called the Blue Shirts, which was a fascist organization back in the early 1900s. And in fact, he wrote some marching songs for them. And he later on, of course, decided to disassociate himself from that very wisely, in my opinion. But he did tend to get interested in things out on the extremes of both politics and his interests in the occult. But I haven't actually researched very much what his association with Crowley was, but undoubtedly there would have been some interest in those activities. Yeah.
Thank you.
I tried to break the motion there, but
Russell, I think you had your hand up first, didn't you?
Can I chip in a little bit? I see how you bring large crowds into these lectures. You put a bit of sex into it. It's your cover is blown, Jack. We now know how to do it.
Brought you in.
Rub off on you if you're not careful.
I usually write under a nom de plume.
Since it's Maori Language Week, I'll have to correct you on Whare Ra, which was Falcon's house in Havelock North. Whare Ra is House of the Sun.
What did I say?
Big house. It's still standing, and it was built from 1913 to 1916 in Tauroa Road, Havelock North, for Falcon. And Falcon was held up a bit by the World War I getting over here, but he managed to get over here in 1919. The house is 3,000 square feet. It's quite big, and downstairs entirely devoted to the vault, which is for the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which apparently petered out in 1978 in New Zealand. But it's got in the book I've got, which is Chapman Taylor's lofty tome about the houses that he built for people in New Zealand. It's got pictures of the vault downstairs. It had 2 pillars at the entrance, and it was guarded by a pair of sphinxes.
Yep.
And unfortunately, none of that exists anymore. It's still down there, but the covers with all the colour, it's been painted over. But they had some pretty magnificent looking coloured bits and pieces downstairs.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Jack. Thank you for everything. I missed last ones on Tuesday a little bit, but I'll get the book and read it up.
I did think I said it was the House of the Sun. I'm aware that that's what Whare Ra means. Yeah.
But interesting order.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
Jack,
George.
again, thank you very much. I've got everything recorded, so we will be able to put these recordings up for everybody to have a look at their leisure in time to come. Thank you for the plug for the SRAA. No less than 12 members here on screen. And Falcon moved to Havelock North, as indeed 1 or 2 other people did, for a very good reason. It's not well known, but Havelock North is the centre of an awful lot of ley lines. And it's a very spiritual sort of place. Andrew Stevenson actually travelled from England to Havelock North when he was about 85. I was walking down Pall Mall with him, having come away from a High Council meeting one day, back towards the railway stations to go our 4 different ways with a couple of other guys. And he announced that he was coming to New Zealand. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You know, I'd just come back from New Zealand in 2004. How long are you going for? Thinking he was going for a holiday. And he said, for keeps. Now, at his age, he never actually got residency here. So every 6 months, he had to go for a holiday to one of the islands and come back. But he was an incredibly spiritual person who came over here specifically to set up the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff that happens in Havelock North.
we'll remember that next time we're in Havelock North, George. And so here we are in the spiritual centre of New Zealand.
Well, it's a bit like
Some of us are here already.
one or two places in England, like Glastonbury, and another place called East Grinstead, which is very similar.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I just, David, you asked me two questions and I'm not sure I answered the second one. Could you tell me what it was again?
Who are you talking to?
David Ciccinati.
David Ciccinati, you had a second.
Oh, yes.
David, I thought you asked
Sorry,
me.
I missed the question.
Okay, I thought there was a second question that I may not have answered for you. Can you remember what it was?
Oh, it was regarding Yeats living with Crowley, but as you said that you didn't research it, so most probably there is no information.
Yeah.
If they lived in the remote community together.
Yeah, I will, for my own interest, have a look at that. Yeah.
People do argue whether it's Aleister Crowley or Aleister Crowley. Crowley himself said it's Crowley to rhyme with holy.
Actually, while you're talking about it, did anybody, I'm talking to New Zealanders here, did anybody go to Te Papa? That's our museum here in Wellington. Did they go to the occult art exhibition? It was fabulous, and there was some of Crowley's work there.
Was it?
Yes.
I would have liked to have gone.
Yeah, it was fabulous. Yeah.
A little side note, I assume that Crowley's commune that you were talking about is called Philima Abbey, and that was in Cefalù in Italy. Until, of course, Crowley was chased out of Italy or made not welcome, sort of persona non grata in Italy by Mussolini.
Yeah. I always thought there was an unusual similarity between the two of them facially.
Okay, any more questions, comments at all? Are we ready to wind it? Oh, yes, sorry, John.
Can I ask a couple of questions? One, why was it, I mean, he was buried in 1939, the beginning of 1939 in France. Why wasn't his body returned until 48? Because, I mean, the Free State was neutral, therefore they could have gone over at any stage.
Yeah, I think it was, being neutral isn't very helpful when there's mines in the water. They're not very discriminating. I suppose that they were erring on the side of caution. That's the only answer I can give. But also, what you need to remember is that the country itself was still in a period of settling down. So I don't think there was anything to be read into it. But it was definitely the existence of the war that did get in the way. Just made the communication and the possibility of doing that sort of run. And when you only got 3 ships, you don't want to risk them unnecessarily.
And the other one was, who did he represent in the Senate?
I think I need to check. I think he was Fine Gael. For those of you who don't know, there's 2 parties. Well, basically 2 parties: Sinn Féin and Fine Gael, and he definitely wasn't Sinn Féin.
It's interesting, Jack, how many of your characters in your story, whether they've fallen out of favor or whatever, have found a home in France or a final resting place in France. Who obviously seems to be much more open and forgiving than the Irish or the English or the Brits in general.
Well, there's a couple of things to that. If you go back to my story about the 1798 rebellion, you will see that the French were actually quite actively involved there, not successfully involved, but actively involved to the point where they landed a very small invasion party of about 1,100 troops, because, as you will remember, the bulk of the force, the weather turned against them and they had to go back to France. So there's always been a close association with Ireland and France, and it's just one of those that's been historically a long association. So there's an affection there, and also the weather is better. So if you can afford it and if you can get away, my cousin, for example, is a fine example. They've got a house in Belfast, very nice house, but they've also got a place down in just outside of Cannes. And they tend to spend a fair bit of the year down there when the weather is somewhat less clement in Ireland.
Well, the French and the Scots and the Spanish and the Irish always had one thing in common, didn't they, Jack? They weren't keen on the English.
Common enemy.
Yeah.
If I could, if I could just,
as an Englishman, I can tell you our main ally is Portugal.
Yes,
it is.
And they don't particularly think much of either the French or the Spanish.
Yeah.
I remember when I studied economics, of course, you studied trade when you studied Portuguese wine and English cloth, I think it was. That was the thing that they used to talk about trade issues. I just need to make something clear for people who may not understand where I come from in this. I'm from Northern Ireland, which is in the British part of Ireland, and I come from a Protestant community, so I understand a lot about that community, and I've got some very firm views about how things happen in that community. But I'm also an Irishman. I only have 2 passports. I have a passport which is New Zealand, of course, and I have a passport which is Irish. My wife is from County Cork in Ireland, and I've got very firm views. I'm very much an Irishman, and I'm quite expert. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I'm quite expert in things like Irish traditional music, for example. And I love Irish culture, Irish literature. Having said all that, I also love lots of things about English culture. I particularly like your beer. I've always liked English beer, particularly Theakston's Old Peculiar. And I like the beer. I like the literature. You know, we don't, the Irish and the English have probably a lot in common as well of things which divide. But I think when I look back on it, my own community would not be very keen on some of my views regarding Ireland at the moment. But I think at the end of the day, the situation is such that there is a decrease in the empire, for example, if you want to call it that. And it's a funny situation that it appears to me that Ireland, which was the first colony, is almost inevitably going to be the last.
The last.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, Jack, there's only 2 people in the world, the Irish and them as want to be.
We've talked about this, Jack, and talked about the remarkable influence that the Irish people have had in the world and in world history in so many areas, in so many ways, for such a small country. And its influence has been absolutely enormous. And I just want to thank you that in the lectures that you've given us, the 6 lectures, you've introduced us to some of that history and some of the influence of the Irish. And you've done it in a wonderful way. You've done it with an Irish sense of humor. But at the same time, I think we've come to realize that there were the difficulties and problems and issues that Ireland had to overcome, and it's still trying to overcome in many, many ways. So I want to thank you very much for what you've done. I know the amount of work that you've put into this, and I think you can be extremely proud of the lectures that you've created, the book you've created, and the presentations that you've given us on these 6 marvelous occasions. So I'm going to raise a glass to you, Jack, say congratulations for a wonderful tour. I know you've got 2 places left, but as far as I'm concerned, for wonderful presentations, congratulations. And thank you, everybody who've come and helped you. You've had marvelous turnouts, always over 50 attendees. So you've done extremely well. Please, everybody, buy a copy of the book, because if you've enjoyed his talks, there's even more in the book. And I've reread several of them, and they're very good when you've got a spare moment just to pick up and read one of those stories. Jack, thank you very, very much. Congratulations.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and it's been my pleasure to do it. But I also want to acknowledge Mike and George for the assistance that they've given as well, and Kerry Nichols as well. To be honest, I couldn't have done it as I did without that assistance. So thank you very much.
It was our pleasure.
Could I just ask a question of you, Mike?
John, of course.
Well, there's 2 questions actually. What is Jack's talks in Palmerston North and New Plymouth? Which ones are they?
That's very, very, yes. I can tell you what I think we had down. Jack can probably remember it. It's in my Was it
Well,
to my-
Hammerston North, I can tell you because I spoke to the secretary.
the
today.
rebellion, wasn't it? Yeah,
No, they want the dirty one. They want sex and symbolism.
second, right?
So that's that one. I think the one for New Plymouth, it's New Plymouth we're talking about, is it?
Yeah,
And now New Plymouth, yes.
The second one. I have a feeling that that's a rerun of the conspiracy one, Napoleon and Wellington, etc.
Yes, two Frenchmen, two Irish.
An Irishman, two Frenchmen,
Frenchmen
and
and-
the Masonic conspiracy.
And a conspiracy. Who'd have thought it? Exactly.
Who'd have thought it?
Right.
Yeah, there are two other stories in the book. One is the Crater Rapoa, which is the Egyptian priestly initiation rites, which may or may not be factual. You have to decide that when you hear the story. I know, George, you've written on the topic as well. And also there's another one called Military Masons, which is to do with two Irish Freemasons who had sterling military careers. One in the 1800s in India, where he died in a battle. That was Sir Rollo Gillespie. He comes from a town. I lived just outside of Belfast, just outside a little village called Comber, Comber. And there's a massive monument to him there that I drove past several times a week, and I never took a blind bit of notice of it. But now that I've researched it, next time I go back, I'm certainly going to look. The biggest collection of Masons in Ireland attended not his funeral because he was buried in India, but attended the opening of his monument. And the other one is one which you'll be more familiar with, because you'll all know about the SAS. And the SAS was formed by Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling during the Second World War, and it was co-founded by Lieutenant Colonel Blair Main, who was a most interesting Irishman. And he got up to some real shenanigans, and he was a Mason in Belfast. Well, not Belfast, Newton Ards, which is just outside of Belfast. So those are two papers which I haven't given in this Zoom talk, because I thought they didn't lend themselves quite so well to the Zoom. I need a bit of sort of physical presence, I think, to get the best out of those. But there's two that are available for giving at some other time.
Right. And of course, he had to be Paddy Main, didn't he?
It had to be Paddy Main.
So don't tell them the story, Jack. They have to buy the book to find the story of those two. So thank you, everybody, and we'll call it a night. You can stop the recording if you haven't already, George, and we'll